to talk about a lot of things. So I'm going to be talking also about information theoretic problems in control. And in this particular workshop or this semester, we've thought a lot about various kinds of autonomous systems. They've varied in terms of the size of operation, in terms of the time scale at which they operate, and in terms of the specific control application that they're tackling. One example of such a system is an autonomous drone, which is similar to the example that Victoria brought up. And in this particular case, this drone, for example, will depend heavily on a set of motors as well as sensors, maybe a wireless channel to communicate with some kind of base station, to be able to achieve the task that it is trying to complete. And what I'm going to be focusing on in this particular talk is how uncertainty and unreliability in the operation of these motors and these sensors is actually going to affect our ability to stabilize and control such a system. So if you think back to the beginning of this semester at the boot camp, where there were some tutorial talks on control, what was introduced was, for example, a standard model for a simple linear control system, which looks very similar to what we have here and is exactly what Victoria introduced in the earlier talk. So here we would have X as being, say, the system state, N would be a time index. We're thinking about a discrete time system. Y might be the observation that is being observed by the controller over some kind of sensing mechanism. The controller is computing U, which is based on these previous observations Y, and Y is then being transmitted to the controller, or is actually being actuated over some actuation mechanism. And then there's, of course, some additive disturbances, such as W and V. In these systems that, for example, were introduced in the boot camp, or even the system that Victoria introduced, one thing we commonly assume is we assume that we know the exact model parameters of the system. So we assume usually that this A matrix, the B matrix, the C matrix are all fixed and known to us exactly. And maybe this is known through some kind of system ID. We understand the parameters of the system, and then we go on to control it. What I want to focus on in this particular talk is what happens when actually we might not know exactly what these system parameters are. What happens when they might be random, they might be time varying? What are our fundamental limits on how we can stabilize and control these systems? And furthermore, can we understand these uncertainties in the model from an informational perspective? This is another kind of uncertainty. It's different from a traditional communication uncertainty. But can we understand their effects in a similar way? And I'm not going to be able to talk fully about all kinds of uncertainties in the system. So I'm not going to be able to cover uncertainties in A and B and C. In this talk, I'll be focusing primarily on uncertainties in the B and the C parameters. But building on actually the talk that Victoria just had, we also have some work together that focuses on what happens when the A in the problem that she was just talking about is also drawn randomly, and how can we adapt the scheme, the zoom in, zoom out scheme that she just mentioned, to deal with that case as well. I'm sure either of us would be happy to answer questions about that later if there's time. So let me talk about why we would want to understand these kind of systems with random parameters. Where do they actually show up? So one example of such of where this might show up is in the case where there's some kind of timing jitter or synchronization errors in your system. In this case, if you have an exponentially growing state, and you have some sampling mechanism that's actually trying to sample your system at certain times, and instead of sampling it at time t, you sample it at some time t plus delta, where delta is random, what you're going to end up with is going to be a multiplicative noise or an unknown parameter in your system. And this can show up on your system gain. It can show up on your observation gain. Another example of where this might show up is a commonly used scheme in control called pulse width modulation. So this is used, for example, to control motors on drones. It's used in thermostats. Probably people who work on the power grid here have also encountered this. The idea here is that you have a voltage pulse, and what you're controlling, your control input is actually the length of the pulse. But in the event that you have some jitter actually on your voltage, so instead of being here, it jitters just by a little bit, again, this is going to show up as a multiplicative noise or an uncertain parameter in your control model. And what we want to understand are what are the fundamental limits that are imposed by these kinds of uncertainties in your system. So today, as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on uncertainty on the actuation side and contrast it with uncertainty on the sensing side. And what we will see is that when your uncertainty is on the actuation side, linear strategies turn out to be optimal. But when the uncertainty is on the sensing side, linear strategies actually turn out to be surprisingly suboptimal, despite how similar the problems are. And we'll understand this a little bit more. And in the process of this, I will talk a little bit about how we can understand this problem on the actuation side and try to understand a fundamental idea of, well, how fast can we actually stabilize a system? Is there a limit that is imposed fundamentally by these uncertainties on our ability to stabilize? I'll talk about this on both the actuation side as well as the sensing side. If there's time at the end, I'll talk about how this idea of thinking about things informationally can help us quantify the impact of having some side information about these parameters and how this can help us design better strategies. Not entirely sure if I'll get to this part of the talk. Again, the work that I'm talking about today is building on a large set of work that has been done over many years. Victoria alluded to a lot of it. I won't go into a lot of these details in the interest of time, but we're building heavily on ideas from, for example, robust control and the uncertainty threshold principle. I was just having a conversation in the break about some of these ideas. But here I'm going to be taking a more stochastic control perspective. And also we're building fundamentally on results such as the data rate theorem, ideas from intermittent Kalman filtering, and most importantly, ideas that go back to Witzenhausen on the value of information in control from the 70s. So let's start. And first, I'm going to focus on uncertainty on the actuation side. So let's think about what happens when your motor has some uncertainty in it. So think about the PWM example here. So let me now give you exactly what the model is. So here I want to think about a very simple scalar system. And here, let's say, x is the system state as usual. And it's evolving according to this equation. X at time n plus 1 is a times xn plus bn times un. To focus on one unknown and uncertain thing at a time, let's say a is fixed and known. But bn is capturing our actuation uncertainty. So let's say bn is coming IID from some distribution PB, which we know. And let's say further that we have a perfect observation. So U is allowed to depend causally on all of the previous system observations. Let's say x naught is drawn from a normal distribution, but this is not particularly important. There's not going to be any memory restrictions on the controller, but we are using causal control. What is our objective here? Okay, we have some system. What do we want to do with it? Our goal is, as is standard in control, is to drive the system to some fixed point. Without loss of generality, we're going to choose this to be 0. And to think about a fundamental requirement for this, we're going to focus initially on second moment stability. So we want to make sure that the second moment of the system is always going to be bounded. Good here? OK, great. So let's start playing with this system just a little bit. The natural thing to try is to try what happens with the simple linear strategy. So let's just take u to be some scalar d times x of n. and see what happens. So turns out that this was exactly what is explored by the uncertainty threshold principle. In their work, they focus on Bn being drawn from a Gaussian distribution. But the same strategy, exactly what they do, applies even more generally, even when Bn is not Gaussian. And what you can see, I'll spare the details of the algebra here, is that this d times Bn times xn just pulls out. So xn just comes out exactly here. And what is of interest is actually the second moment of this random variable, a plus d times Bn. You can do some very simple calculus to find out what is exactly the best d, what is the best scalar multiple that you can use to minimize this in a greedy fashion. You can compute this d. Whoops. That was not intended. PowerPoint crashed. Sorry about that. I heard that. It's okay.
Looks stable. Or instead of uncountable.
Just wanted to build up more dramatics till my first point. OK. So what we're saying is that, let's say you did some algebra, and you computed what is the optimal linear control. You can do this by just doing some simple calculus. And here you can show, well, this system is only going to be stabilizable if your gain a, which is known, a squared is smaller than 1 plus mu squared over sigma squared, where mu and sigma are the mean and standard deviation of this random variable b. And this is exactly the condition that was found by Athens and co-authors. And furthermore, they used a simple dynamic programming argument to show that this is actually the exactly optimal strategy for this problem.
What happens if sigma b squared goes to 0, right? It's something strange.
If sigma b squared goes to 0, then you know exactly b, right? And so
But the result is telling you that you need a bound of infinity.
No, what's the problem?
It's bounded. It's always bounded.
if sigma b squared goes to 0, then you're always good.
Oh, you're dealing with a beta.
OK. So let's play with this. But since we sent, let's look instead at the case, what happens when actually mu b is 0. So let's take a very simple example, which is almost trivial. Let's look at this case where b is now uniform on -1 to 1. And we see here that in this case, the optimal control is actually to set u to be exactly equal to 0. Why is this the case? Let's say I tell you exactly that your state is going to be, you're moving along this line, your state is exactly here. And you're going to put in like this amount of effort to move to that state. But this b can flip your sign. So when I put in my control, I don't know if I'm going to actually get closer to my target or if I'm going to move equally far away from my target. And given that I don't know this in a second moment sense, it turns out that the optimal thing to do is just to do nothing. And so what we see is that the best maximum a that you can stabilize is when the system is already essentially self-stabilizing, or a is smaller than 1. So if I was to choose some a larger than 1, for example, 1.4, and I choose the optimal control for second moment stabilization, what I get is a plot like this. On a log-log scale, I see that xn is blowing up exponentially. This is why it's a log-log plot, so the lines are straight lines. But what if now I told you that actually I can find a control such that I can generate the following trajectories for this exact same system with a equal to 1.4. Again, on a log-log plot, what I see here now is that all of these trajectories, these are, I think, 50 or 100 trajectories, these are all decaying exponentially. So we just computed that, oh, actually, the optimal control in the second moment sense is to do nothing, to have 0.
But I think something odd about the language, because you said it's stable if, but it's not an only if already.
It's an if and only if. It's stable in the second moment sense, if and only if.
Oh, it is, okay. What is optimal? You didn't define a criterion for optimal.
I'm saying that the largest A for which you can stabilize in the second moment sense. So I'm trying to find the largest A, or alternatively, I'm trying to find the maximal decay rate. But you're exactly coming to my point, which is that maybe second moment sense of stability, which is what we traditionally look at in control, isn't the only sense of stability that we should be looking at. And this has been understood in the literature before.
But that's also, you're trying to do something universal over all B's, right? Looking at just the mu and the sigma. Whereas your simulation
Yes.
for a specific B, so that's another reason why it might not be.
So I'm trying to do something. I'm assuming that I know the distribution.
I mean, the theorem that you gave is giving you a bound on the right that only depends on the mean and the variance.
Yes.
I'm guessing that it's presumably a universal theorem, whereas your simulations are for a specific choice of the distribution of B. So it might be for specific distributions you get better bounds.
So it turns out, yes, that is true. It turns out that for second moment stability, all that matters is the mean and the variance. But for other notions of stability, the entire distribution of B is actually exactly what will matter. And so
you're saying that the second moment stability, the threshold is the same for all distributions that have the same mean and variance?
Yes. Okay, so what I want to now say is that instead, maybe we should look at this other notion of stability, which is stability and probability. And this has been introduced in the past in the literature by people such as Sardar Yüksel or Matveev and Savkin, as well as co-authors. And here what I want to think about is I want to think, instead of looking at the second moment, I want to think about the density of the system state. And I want to say that I'm going to say the system is stable in probability as long as the probability mass is not running off to infinity. So I can make sure that for every n, the system state is bounded in a box with high probability, or with probability 1 minus epsilon. And this is a notion of stability that is basically the weakest notion of stability. If you do not have stability in probability, you cannot have any notion of moment stability, which is easy to see. So now the question is, well, here I did some calculation and I got some control that showed that these system states were actually decaying. The question is, for how large can this A be so that I can still generate these decaying trajectories? Can I keep coming up with some strategy or the other? If I make A 1,000,000, is there still going to be some trajectory or some control that is going to decay my system? And this need not be the case. And so the question is, what is this fundamental limit on my ability to actually stabilize the system? And so we want to actually define this. We want to say that this maximum growth rate, we want to understand what this is. What is the maximum growth rate for which there exists a control strategy such that I can keep my system stable in probability? It turns out that we can actually compute the value of this. And it's given by this very simple expression. And the nice thing that we see is that as a byproduct of this, linear strategies can actually are optimal in the sense that any A that can be stabilized can also be stabilized by a linear strategy. And I'm thinking about stability in the sense of stability in probability.
So is there a sort of a vector form of this place? If you have a system that's controllable, then there's a corresponding theorem for the vector case. Or is it, because you've just been talking about scalar case so far?
Yes. So the vector case turns out to be somewhat more tricky. 2 dimensions is somewhat understandable, but in 3 dimensions, like random walks, are always diverging, so things become slightly more complicated. And the naive generalizations, which I thought would easily work out, do not work out quite as easily. So vector cases become slightly more complicated. For some simple vector situations, we can understand this in the cases where, for example, the noises are symmetric, but this is still some work in progress, and I don't fully understand the general vector case. So it's an interesting open question.
Sorry, I missed. What's the connection between C0 and A?
Oh, so C0 is the largest log A, such that I can actually have this system be stable in probability. So I can have these decaying trajectories.
In the case of vector case, you need to also worry about whether the feed control is a measurement feedback control or a full state feedback control. That means that yn need not be equal to xn.
Yes, it might not be equal to xn. So in this case, I'm focusing on this very, very simple case to understand what's going on. Yeah.
Do these controls depend on the distribution of B?
These controls do depend on the distribution of B, yes. And yeah, you would compute basically this optimal D according to exactly this calculation.
More questions?
Okay. So where is this coming from? Let me give some intuition about it. So for the achievability, where is this? Let's say we just use a basic linear strategy. So let's say un is just a times some d times some yn. Then I can write xn as basically this product of random variables times this initial state x naught. And now if I just want to minimize this, I can just take a log, and this product will become a sum. And I'm going to get exactly an expression just like this. So I can see exactly how a linear strategy can achieve this bound. And for the converse argument, which is the more interesting part, I won't have time to go into details, but it's basically a martingale argument that shows that even if you used a nonlinear strategy, its performance will always be bounded by the performance of this linear strategy. So the nice thing about having this explicit formula is that actually what we can do is we can compute this quantity. So what I'm plotting here is on the x-axis is the log of mu b to sigma b, where mu is the mean and sigma is the standard deviation of this random variable b. The y-axis is the log of the maximum growth, a. And I'm looking at it for three distributions. The first is when b is drawn from a Gaussian distribution. The next is when it's drawn from an erasure. And the third is when it's drawn from a uniform. And if we were to look at second moment stability, what we see is exactly this green curve. All three of these actually follow exactly the same curve. And basically we see is that as mu is going to 0, this control capacity, or our maximum log that we can stabilize, is also going to 0. But now if we think about stability and probability, let's say for the uniform case or for the Gaussian case, we see that actually in a stability and probability sense, we can actually stabilize for some a that's strictly larger than 0. So this is for the uniform, this is for the Gaussian. And turns out for the erasure case, we actually have, if we were to think about stability and probability, we actually have an infinite maximum tolerable growth rate. Why is this the case? Because even if I get a string of zeros, with probability 1, eventually I'm going to get a perfect control that's going to hit. And then I will be able to send my system to 0 and have this infinite decay rate. So it turns out that it's not just second moment and stability and probability. These are two notions. We can actually think about this as a family of notions of stability by looking at different moments of stability. So we can think about stability of the 8th moment of the system state and say, what is the maximum A for which we can stabilize something in the 8th moment sense? And I won't go into the details of the definition or anything, but just I'll show you this plot So what this is showing is on the x-axis is the moment of stability that is being considered. On the y-axis, again, we're plotting the maximum growth. This point at which all of these curves intersect, or they're concurrent, is the 2-2 point. So we're looking at the second moment stability. And here, basically, what we see is that the Gaussian, B being uniform, B being an erasure channel, all behave exactly the same. So if we were to focus exclusively on second moment stability, as we mentioned earlier, it's just the mean and the standard deviation that matters. You cannot differentiate between the shapes of the distributions. But when you start looking at different moments, you see that actually these behave quite differently. And furthermore, as eta, as the moment of stability tends to 0, actually we converge exactly to this notion of stability and probability. So the limit of C eta as eta goes to 0, we can prove is exactly the C naught that I defined earlier. And we can also define a notion of zero error control capacity, which is what we think of in robust control, where we might have worst case noise. And as eta goes to infinity, we're ending up in that extreme. And this I'm plotting for a specific B, where this mu to sigma ratio is 3. But this will hold for any plot. Yeah.
In the C2 that you have mentioned,
yeah.
It seems very much like the log 1 plus SNR
yeah.
kind of channel capacity theorem.
So that was exactly the kind of motivation that initially led to, let's see if can we understand this as some kind of capacity, just because of this parallel half log 1 plus mu squared over sigma squared, which is also why I've been making these plots with this log SNR. But it's a cute coincidence that this happens. This was also actually noticed. Nicola Elia had this as a comment in one of his papers that, in this special case, in this second moment, this also happens. But I think intellectually or philosophically, this seems to extend, but this formula is just happens to match. Okay, and so one other nice thing that happens as a side effect of this is that now that we have this characterization of the maximum growth rate in bits, we can also actually quantify the value of side information in control. So if I was to give you some extra bits exactly about, let's say, this uncertainty in B, I can compute exactly how this would affect the maximum A that I could actually stabilize the system by. If I have time at the end, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but I'm not entirely sure. The nice thing is that this is like a simple conditional expectation that we can actually also compute. How much time do I have?
Between 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay. So I'll just briefly talk a little bit about this contrast on the sensing side. So here I want to now contrast this actuation uncertainty with uncertainty on the sensing side. And let's think now about, instead of having this multiplicative noise on the control, this multiplicative noise being on the sensing side. So let's think of Z as being drawn from some distribution, let's say a Gaussian. And again, let's now go back to thinking about the usual second moment stability. If we were to try and do the same thing that we did in the other case, let's try and do the linear strategy. Turns out that the maximum decay rate that you can achieve using a linear strategy, whether the multiplicative uncertainty is on the sensing or the control, is actually exactly the same. This is because when I just put d times z times xn as in terms of un, the algebra is the same. The controller cannot just tell the difference between multiplicative uncertainty on the actuation versus multiplicative uncertainty on the sensing when it's restricted to doing linear things. And so here we have this achievability, but we do not know whether this is optimal. The same techniques that were used in the uncertainty threshold principle to prove that this is optimal don't actually work. And for a long time I was wondering, maybe I just can't make them work. But turns out that they don't work for a good reason. And that's because in this case, linear strategies are actually suboptimal. And to see why that's the case, think about the following situation. Let's say your Z was drawn from a normal 1, 1. And let's say you saw the following string of observations. You saw a 2, then you saw a 1, then you saw a 4, then you saw a 3, and then suddenly you saw a million. With this history, does it make sense to just use a linear control that's memoryless and just assumes that the state is now something close to a million? Probably not. Probably in this case, what this is saying is that, oh, you just had an atypical noise realization. Ignore this observation and do something that seems more reasonable. So this says that, oh, well, maybe a linear memoryless strategy is not going to be optimal. Can we use somehow memory? It turns out that if we try to use a linear memory full strategy that uses the previous observations, this is not going to help. And you can actually prove that if you're restricted to using a linear strategy, the linear memoryless is optimal. Why is this the case? Because when you take a linear, when I remove my best linear estimate, I'm basically making my state orthogonal to my observation. I'm removing this projection. And so my next observation has no information about the state because I've already removed anything from the past. So the new observation is only related to the new noise. So fundamentally, what you have to do is something nonlinear. And what we have is basically a simple nonlinear strategy that actually strictly outperforms the linear strategy. And what it really is a hack strategy. This is far from optimal. And I think a really interesting open question is, what is the optimal strategy in this case? What we see with this very simple strategy, what I'm plotting here is, again, mu z, which is the mean of z. And the y-axis is basically the ratio of the optimal A that can be, or the maximum A that can be stabilized using the nonlinear strategy to that which can be stabilized using the linear strategy. I'm just subtracting 1 because that trivially works. And you can see that this nonlinear strategy can do infinitely better than the linear strategy. So the question is, of course, like, how much better can you do? Can you do unboundedly better? Turns out that that's not the case. We can prove a converse result that says that actually there is a maximum A beyond which any strategy, linear or nonlinear, cannot stabilize the system. And it's interesting that to prove this, actually, we had to go back to this notion of stability and probability. Basically, we show that this cannot be stabilized in probability by looking at the density of the system state and how it's evolving. And because it cannot be stabilized in probability, it also cannot be stabilized in a second moment sense. In the interest of time, I'm really not going to go through the proof of this, but I'm happy to talk more. But what I think is a really interesting open question is this bound, this converse bound that we have and the achievability are really quite far off. And a really interesting question is, well, can we close this gap? The problem is so simple to write down, but we do not know what the optimal control strategy is for this kind of system. So with that, I guess I can stop unless people are really interested in, I think I'm out of time. So I can,
Yeah,
5 to 10.
So you have 5 to 10 minutes uniformly distributed.
OK. So then I'll tell you a little bit about this side information part that I didn't talk much about. So for this, to talk about how side information is interesting and why I think this is an interesting direction, I want to go back to a problem that has been looked at many times in control. It's very related to the intermittent Kalman filtering problem or the drop control problem. And here, let's think about a vector system. So let's think about a vector system which is being controlled by a scalar controller. And what's happening here is that the system is observed perfectly. The control is a scalar control, but it's dropped with some probability PE. So with probability PE, all you send is a 0. And this problem has been studied by Nicola Ilya, Sardar Yüksel, Lucas Genato, and as well as others. And a combination of these results actually helps us understand the exact trade-offs for stabilizing this problem, again, in the second moment sense. And let's say we're thinking about a diagonalized system with eigenvalues lambda 1, lambda 2, all distinct along the diagonal. Then all these results show that this system is stabilizable in the second moment sense when the system growth, which is the sum of the logs of the unstable eigenvalues, is smaller than half log 1 over PE, where PE is the drop probability of this channel. So let's just plot this. And on a log-log scale, this is just a straight line. So we see basically that as the system gets more and more unstable, the tolerable drop probability keeps on decreasing. The question, of course, is, I've been talking about side information. Can we somehow provide side information to this problem to actually improve the performance of the system? So what kind of side information is available here? Well, there's only one parameter in the system, which is the drops that are happening. So can we somehow provide side information about the drops? It turns out that if you have some kind of MAC layer protocol or some scheduling protocol, it might well know that, oh, I'm seeing some congestion in the system. The next few packets are probably going to be dropped. And this information could potentially be given to a controller that could then use it to plan exactly what its controls are. And so what we observe is that actually it turns out that if you were to provide this side information about all future arrivals and drops in the system to the controller, it can actually move from this blue line of performance to this green line. So you get a scaling gain by providing this non-causal side information. And
Future arrival is one realization, or?
so the future arrivals is, I'm thinking of basically an infinite sequence of every single drop or every single arrival that's going to happen. It's equivalent, for example, in, let's say we had a two-dimensional system, to just know when is the next arrival. That will also get you this performance.
But it's random, so it's one particular.
Yeah, so you will tell, so you will, in the realization that I'm operating in. So right now so one particular realization, yeah, exactly. And turns out that this green line matches the performance of this very related problem, which is the intermittent Kalman filtering problem. So here, what was happening is now you again have a vector system, but it's being observed over a scalar channel, which is lossy. And here, instead of the sum of the logs of the eigenvalues mattering, actually all that matters is the log of the maximum eigenvalue. So in this case, somehow this observation problem is easier. In fact, it can tolerate higher drop probability than the control problem. And what we're seeing is that by providing this future information about the drops, we can match the performance of this observation problem.
There's something that you can do that is different from this. That when you sense the state is sending the feedback, and there's going to be eventually a drop, you can continue. You can always store stuff that you're sending, and then if there's a drop, you can send it later on. I mean, but it's delayed feedback.
You can store stuff that
on the state where you're sensing it, so store it there.
Yeah.
And if it goes through, fine. If it doesn't go through, then send it at a future time. Then. But you will effectively be giving delayed feedback to the controller.
Yeah, so I think that would be that.
And so sometimes delayed feedback works. I mean, it's just you might change the margin of stability.
So I think that would be actually equivalent. So you're saying instead of giving the future drops, you're saying just store the current state.
Yeah, like
but why would I send?
Like a retransmit sort of thing, right?
But why would I send the previous information when I could send the current state, which is more useful for because my controller I'm not assuming any bounds on the power of my controller. Okay.
You have timestamp what you're collecting and then you're transmitting it.
Right.
And something drops, you just retransmit it. It's clear when it was taken. And I don't know if the controller can use it to do something.
I think you could retransmit it, but it might be more valuable to transmit the new information as opposed to the old information, because I'm going to act now. So I think if you were to do some kind of incremental coding, then that would be useful. But I think it might not be that different. But I'll just quickly finish. So basically, you were pointing out that knowing the infinite future is somewhat unreasonable, which is indeed somewhat unreasonable. So it's a good thing to point out. But you can actually get a similar scaling gain by just having one step of look ahead. So I just need to know whether the next packet is going to be dropped or not. And of course, 2 steps of look ahead would get you a little bit better and a little bit better and so on. But with that, I will actually conclude. I didn't have really time to talk about the case when the system gain A itself is random. But what we did talk about is that first, I think this interesting observation that multiplicative noise on the actuation side is somehow information theoretically harder to tackle than this multiplicative noise on the sensing side. And this kind of, I feel, model uncertainty can be really thought about as informational bottlenecks, very similar to the rate-limited control that Victoria was talking about. And I think there's many interesting open questions at this intersection. For example, there's this need for a tight achievability converse pair in the sensing problem that I talked about. But there's also a lot of interesting questions in understanding how and when side information can help, how can we quantify it, so on and so forth. So thank you.
So in the second situation where you have multiplicative noise on the sensor side, that's a non-classical information problem. So it's not surprising that linear is not optimal in that situation.
Yeah.
If you use these sign functions kind of strategies, then you can potentially do much better.
I was curious about your impossibility result.
Uh-huh.
Please go back to that slide. I don't know what exactly it was. I mean, I didn't get the assumptions under which you're taking that. Yeah, I guess this was it.
So I'm assuming that, let's say Z has some density. So that's an important assumption. Let's say X naught also has some density. U can be any function of Y naught. UN can be any function of Y naught to Yn, so a causal controller. Then I'm saying that this, for any strategy, for choose your M, no matter how big you choose your box, your probability mass is going to run out of that box. So you're not going to be stable in probability.
Even if Z is a fixed sign, and so it still work with it.
Even if Z is fixed sign.
Z is random, but is always positive.
Yes, even then that will happen. For large enough A, and this A is very large. So, but I mean, I don't think this A is very large as a function of our proof technique, not as a function of. I think the fundamental limit on A will be quite small. But
you need a positive variance on Z, right?
you need a positive variance on Z, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, the positive variance on Z is an assumption. If you is the only assumption.
While I appreciate the depth you have gone to the scalar system, coming from an aerospace engineering background, I do think that the vector situation should be more relevant for practical applications.
Yes.
There, right away, in that B matrix, so-called B, now it becomes a matrix for B.
Mm-hmm.
And then right there, when we assume uncertainty in the B matrix, we guys working in the deterministic perspective have been bogged down by the controllability situation under uncertainty. So the moment it is B is uncertain, inherently the control is limited as to stabilize the system.
Yes.
Because controllability comes into picture.
Exactly.
Under some parameter variations,
Exactly.
it becomes uncontrollable. So I was wondering whether at least at Microsoft or somewhere in the information theory, are there any attempts to attack a little long, kind of a more so-called vector version of all these things?
So I have some work with some co-authors on looking at exactly when B is a matrix and looking at vector versions of this problem. Fundamentally, it's a very difficult problem. It involves, But for special cases, we can have some results. I think taking them fully to actually practice is quite a ways away. This is focusing really on.
That means there's a lot of more research to be done.
There's a lot more work to be done. Yes.
I was going to ask, since the first part of your talk, you essentially assumed a linear system of some sort, but it seemed like you should be, even if I had a nonlinear function, you should be able to figure out what's the appropriate moment which can be stabilized.
So a linear function, so you mean like?
So if you now had a function
like some here, so.
A times x, if there was a general f,
Uh-huh.
in terms of sort of, like say the Lipschitz order, the Lipschitz constants of f, can you sort of figure out what's the appropriate sort of moment which can be stabilized?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think it will require some work to precisely figure it out.
Getting it tight seems hard, but
Getting it tight would be definitely something challenging, but I think that's a really nice question, yeah.
So what if you had like control costs here? So you penalize u squared, can you study trade-offs between?
I think it's also a really good question. I think the exact techniques that work here will not go through as easily. But I think that is one of the very important questions, right? Like, for example, really, all of these results are fundamentally using the fact that, oh, you know, I'll let u grow very large if x grows very large. And clearly that's not going to work always.
The other question is, are there implications of these trade-offs on like system design? So for example, if I had some budget on designing sensors or actuators with bounded.
Yeah, that's exactly where I want this to go. These are like theoretical results in this simple case, but I think it's interesting to say that, well, you know, again, abstracting away a lot from these theoretical results, but what this is saying is that if you're going to have some variance and you're going to put it either on your B or your C, put it on your C, right? It's saying that spend your budget on having a high quality actuator, because a low quality sensor you can compensate by computation on the control side. But a low quality actuator, there's nothing you can do.
Funny and hard to believe your result, if you don't mind. So you can just go back to it for a second. So there's no noise at all in the system. The one with the V is fixed, right? Yeah, so
Here, yeah.
So the noise is, there's no noise apparently in the system, right? So if Z was say like, you know, either 2 or 3 with equal probabilities are.
So fundamentally it's important to have a density.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. So like think about, like this would hold.
You can't sort of just get to 0 and sit there or something. I mean, it's Z which is either 2 or 3 property.
Yeah, but Z, exactly. Yeah, with Z if Z is either 2 or 3, this does not hold. I'm critically relying on the fact that Z has a density. So Z is uniform between 2 and 3, or Z is uniform between 2 and 2.1. This still holds.
It's interesting. I don't know if it's true.
Well.
Okay, with that, let's thank Gireeja and Victoria. Yes. So your control capacity